Darkness enveloped the house, with only the flicker of a candle lighting the table. Carl clutched his phone, staring at the screen where a single message burned. "You were amazing last night. I want to do it again." His heart sank. Who was it meant for? Annabelle appeared in the doorway, flawless in a new dress. "I'm heading to Emily's. She's having a party," she said, her tone cold and detached. "What kind of party?" Carl asked, masking his unease. "Her new boyfriend wants to impress us. They say he's rich." She kissed him on the cheek and walked out. Carl sat in the silence, feeling the pieces of a troubling puzzle snap into place. Was this the end, or the beginning of something that would shatter their world? The cheating wife thought she had one, but Karma and I had other plans. This is impossible to believe. Carl woke up early, as usual. The morning was ordinary. A cup of coffee, a few hours of work on the computer, and planning for the future. Annabelle, his wife, worked later. She was always busy. Carl loved this routine. Everything was stable, and he was convinced their marriage was cloudless. Annabelle was energetic, attractive, and often spent her time organizing various events and working in marketing. Her life, like his, seemed perfect, although lately, Carl began to notice that she had changed. These were minor things. Staying late at the office, being late for dinners, unexplained outings with friends. But he didn't give it much importance. Still, something inside him began to stir uneasily. Recently, she had become strangely quiet. They spent less time together. Evenings were either spent in front of the TV, or she would go to another room, absorbed in her phone. Sometimes, Carl caught her gaze when she seemed to be thinking about something else entirely. One evening, while they were having dinner, Annabelle looked especially distant. "Annabelle, is everything okay? You've been so absent lately," Carl said, raising an eyebrow. She looked at him, and there was something on her face that Carl couldn't quite place. It wasn't guilt, just something unusual, not like before. "Everything's fine, just a lot of work," she replied, smiling. But that look didn't leave her face. Carl nodded, trying not to dwell on it. But the depth of her gaze left a certain doubt in his heart. A few days later, Carl went on a business trip, and when he returned, he noticed that everything seemed the same, but her behavior had grown even stranger. She stopped looking the way she used to. Her smile became less sincere, and sometimes he even noticed her phone buzzing with messages. But what surprised Carl the most was that one day, when he approached her, she suddenly turned off the screen. Nevertheless, Carl tried not to focus on it. He didn't want to be paranoid. His relationship with Annabelle still seemed very strong. One evening, coming home early, he found her in the hallway with someone else. Not a stranger, but Miles, her business partner, who seemed to have dropped by for a few minutes to discuss some matters. "Oh, you're home early?" Annabelle said, slightly surprised when she saw Carl. "Yes, unexpectedly," he replied, though it was hard not to notice the strange expression on her face. She was relaxed, almost too much so. Her eyes looked as if she was observing something or someone, and her smile was barely visible. "Everything's fine, Carl. We were just discussing a few work details. We have many joint projects right now," Miles added. Carl nodded, though something in his heart began to beat faster. Something was wrong. He could feel it. The next day, he wanted to talk to Annabelle, but she was busy and in the bathroom, and he was occupied with things around the house. Entering their bedroom, he accidentally came across her laptop left on the table. He felt an irresistible urge to check what she was doing online, even though he knew it was wrong. Carl opened the laptop, and the first thing he saw was several strange messages on the screen. Messages from Miles. There weren't many, but the details caught Carl's attention. Their messages seemed oddly romantic, more than just work-related. "You can't imagine how much I look forward to our next meeting," Miles wrote in one of the messages, and it felt too personal. "You always look so beautiful, and those eyes, they drive me crazy." Carl licked his lips, trying not to think about what he had just read. He quickly closed the laptop, feeling his heart start to race. His mind couldn't believe what he had just seen. Annabelle and Miles? It didn't make sense, but it wasn't enough to understand the whole picture. Carl felt that he needed to find out more to confirm his suspicions. He reopened the laptop and continued browsing the browser history. What he saw made him shiver. The videos Annabelle had been watching lately were entirely out of character for her. They were recordings of romantic scenes that she would never usually watch. Carl also found a conversation between her and her best friend, Emily, discussing different men. It looked very strange, like they were picking out men for themselves. Emily was always mysterious to Carl. Though he knew her, they didn't talk much. But lately, Annabelle had been spending a lot of time with Emily. They even started dressing alike. Carl heard the door open and turned around. Annabelle stood in the doorway of the bedroom, her face showing slight apprehension. "What are you doing?" she asked, raising her eyebrows slightly. Carl quickly closed the laptop and stood up, trying to collect his thoughts. "I was just checking something," he replied, trying not to look suspicious. But he felt that Annabelle could sense his confusion. She said nothing, just quietly nodded and went back to the bathroom. Carl felt the pressure in his chest grow stronger. One thought wouldn't leave him. What exactly was Annabelle hiding? A few days later, Carl saw Emily come to their home again. She had always been a mystery to him. She and Annabelle spent a lot of time together, and with each visit, Carl felt more and more detached from them. This time, when Emily came over, they sat on the couch, whispering something to each other and laughing, while also staring at their phones. Their eyes never met his. They only glanced at each other. Carl decided he couldn't stay silent any longer. "What are you two up to?" he asked, trying to appear calm. Annabelle and Emily exchanged glances, and then Annabelle quickly changed the subject. "Oh, we're just planning our next trip," she said, but her voice sounded a bit too suspicious. Carl couldn't let it go but decided to talk to Emily separately. When she stepped out onto the balcony, he followed her. "Emily, have you found someone new?" he asked, trying not to sound overly curious, but he couldn't hold back. Emily turned to him with a smile. "Oh, Carl, I enjoy the single life," she replied nonchalantly. "I can spend time with different men, give them gifts, and it's wonderful. No obligations, you know? I love feeling free." Carl began to feel that everything was coming together. Emily was very steadfast in her lifestyle, and her influence on Annabelle was obvious. He saw how often Annabelle spent time with her lately. They started dressing alike, going to the same places. It was all strange but increasingly clear. "And you want Annabelle to live like that too?" Carl asked, trying to understand where this was all heading. Emily smiled again, and her smile was sinister. "I'm just showing her how to get more out of life," she said casually. "Let her decide for herself how to live." That answer completely changed everything for Carl. He realized that Emily's influence on Annabelle was stronger than he thought. Everything he did and how he behaved was becoming increasingly questionable. Annabelle was becoming more closed off, and whenever he tried to talk to her about something important, she always found excuses to change the subject. She often smiled when Carl mentioned Miles, her business partner, though she didn't seem overly enthusiastic about the topic. Carl began to notice how she was becoming more secretive, as if hiding something. He couldn't understand why the closeness they once had had vanished. One evening, when Carl came home earlier than usual, he noticed Annabelle sitting at her laptop again. This time, she was very focused, but when she saw him standing nearby, she immediately closed the screen. "What are you doing?" he asked, trying to stay calm. Annabelle smiled nervously, placing her hand on the keyboard. "Oh, just checking a few things. I'm working, you know." She barely met his gaze, and Carl noticed that something was off. Carl noticed that Annabelle was on a dating site. "Why are you on a dating site?" Carl couldn't stop himself from asking. Annabelle turned away, her face tense. She looked at the screen and then back at him. "Carl, you can't be serious. I'm just helping Emily. She's told me so many times how hard it is for her to find someone who meets her standards. I'm just doing my best to help her." Her words sounded quite convincing, but Carl couldn't shake the feeling that it was just a cover. I see, but it seems a bit strange," he said. "You found me, and we're already together. Why is this so complicated?" Annabelle hesitated a little, but then lifted her head and said, trying to appear confident, "It's just helping, Carl. Nothing more. And you really have nothing to worry about. Everything's fine. I'm with you. But Emily, you know how she always changes men. I just want to find someone steady for her, so she can finally be happy." Although Carl had his doubts, he decided not to push the matter further. He tried to believe it was just a misunderstanding of the situation. However, he couldn't help but notice how often Annabelle started going on business meetings with Miles. At first, he paid no attention, but over time, the frequency of these meetings increased. What was even stranger, every time he asked about her day, Annabelle gave very superficial answers, unwilling to go into details. One day, Carl decided to adjust his approach and not just stand idly by. He became more observant. After a few days of staying home, he realized her schedule was changing. She was no longer home until late in the evening, and every conversation she had with Miles carried a casual warmth he hadn't heard before. It wasn't obvious infidelity, but the small hints and changes in her behavior became so noticeable that Carl felt increasingly confused. At one point, when Annabelle went on another meeting with Miles, Carl decided to visit the office where Miles worked. His heart beat faster with anxiety, but he told himself it was just to learn more about Annabelle's work affairs. When he arrived at the office, he asked the security guard if he could find out where Miles was. "He's in his office," the guard replied, not paying much attention to Carl. Carl pressed his lips together and headed to the office. Walking inside, he saw Miles sitting at his desk, looking over some documents. "Hi, Miles," Carl said, trying to keep calm. "Oh, hi, Carl. I didn't expect you. How are you? How's Annabelle?" Miles greeted him warmly, but Carl noticed a slightly cautious look in his eyes. "Is she working?" Carl asked, trying to keep the conversation natural. Miles leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Yes, of course, she's at an important meeting right now, so I'm on my own again." Carl noticed how Miles frowned, and his words took on a slightly more formal tone. He felt something was off. Carl said goodbye to Miles and went back to his own office. Carl's mind was working at full speed, but he couldn't figure out what was really going on. He sat in his office, trying to focus on work, but his thoughts kept returning to his recent visit to Miles. That day, Miles mentioned that he often stayed alone in the office while Annabelle went to important client meetings. This information didn't quite fit Carl's picture of things. He had always assumed she spent most of her time with Miles, but now it seemed she was going somewhere else without him. The next day, Emily, Annabelle's friend, showed up at their house again. And not just Emily, but with a very interesting companion, a businessman. He arrived in a luxurious Ferrari, which immediately raised Carl's suspicions. He realized this wasn't just a casual meeting. This man clearly had status. Emily seemed completely unfazed, but Carl couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "Hi, Carl, this is Robert, a friend of mine," Emily said as she and the businessman entered the living room. Robert, the businessman, immediately turned his attention to Annabelle. He greeted her and said, "You told me your friend is very beautiful, and I can see you weren't lying." He didn't take his eyes off Annabelle as he spoke. Carl felt uncomfortable hearing those words. He understood it was meant as a compliment, but it sounded far too personal. Suspicion started creeping into his mind. "Nice to meet you," he replied, trying to ignore the situation, though his heart was beating faster inside. Everyone sat down at the table. Robert brought out expensive champagne and whiskey, proposing a toast to the pleasant gathering. They drank and talked, but Carl increasingly felt that this was not just a casual get-together. Something about the atmosphere made him uneasy. "Why would Annabelle's friend bring a man to our house?" he thought to himself, trying not to appear too suspicious. He watched the guests closely, noting their every move. Emily took Annabelle by the hand, and they stepped aside. They started whispering to each other, occasionally glancing at Robert. A series of questions began racing through Carl's mind. This was becoming too strange. Their glances at Robert seemed shared, as if they knew something and had met him before. Why was Annabelle behaving this way? And Emily, how was she so familiar with Robert? Carl continued observing the situation, trying to piece together the details, but refrained from voicing his suspicions out loud. This didn't seem like an ordinary meeting with friends. A plan started forming in his head, one where everything was far more complicated than it appeared. They stayed until late evening. Everyone seemed to enjoy the time, drinking and chatting, but Carl grew increasingly uneasy. Every glance between Annabelle, Emily, and Robert felt like a signal to him that something was wrong. The feeling of betrayal began clouding his thoughts, even though he didn't want to believe it. At the end of the evening, when night had fallen, Annabelle suggested that the guests stay overnight. Why not stay? We don't mind, she said with a smile, glancing at Carl. He didn't respond, though his thoughts were racing. Robert and Emily readily agreed to stay. Everyone moved to another room to continue socializing, while Carl remained at the table, struggling with his restless thoughts. He felt that this night would not be as ordinary as all the others. But what could he do? Did he have the right to ask anything? He couldn't decide whether he wanted to know the truth. He resolved to leave all his suspicions for tomorrow, but something inside him wouldn't let him rest. Time passed, and the night fell. Carl sat on the bed in his bedroom, hearing sounds from the other room, laughter and conversations, but his heart was beating faster than usual. He couldn't stop his thoughts. Whatever the truth was, it just didn't make sense to him. Annabelle came to Carl and invited him to continue having fun with the guests. Reluctantly, Carl went with her. Carl entered the room where everyone was sitting. The night dragged on slowly, and Carl felt the tension within him growing. The feeling that something was wrong didn't leave him for a moment. The room was warm, and on the couch sat all three, Annabelle, Emily, and Robert, watching a movie. Carl, as always, tried to stay calm, but every glance Robert gave, every phrase he said, and even his silences were too expressive for Carl. Carl sat in an empty chair near the couch, and his gaze accidentally fell on Robert's neck. 2 red marks were clearly visible, as if someone had recently kissed him there. It was so obvious that Carl couldn't ignore it. He averted his eyes and tried to maintain outward composure. But inside, everything was churning. Why had Robert become so close to Annabelle and Emily? While Carl tried to calm himself, the girls began whispering to each other. Annabelle and Emily left for another room, leaving the men alone. At that moment, Robert abruptly changed his tone and addressed Carl. "Listen, Carl, I'm curious. Where do you work, Carl?" he asked, smiling as if they were old friends. "How much do you earn? How's life in general?" Carl was forced to answer, though every word was hard for him. He didn't like how Robert was asking these questions. They felt like attempts to extract something personal, something meaningful to Robert alone, but Carl couldn't explain why it bothered him. "I work at a small firm," Carl began, trying to sound as neutral as possible. "The salary isn't high, but it's enough to live on. Honestly, everything's fine." Robert nodded, but his next question was even stranger. "And is your wife happy with that? Is she happy with you?" he asked, looking Carl straight in the eyes. "Can you provide for her?" Carl felt his heart begin to race. Why was he asking this? This was too personal. But Carl couldn't refuse to answer, so he said, "She's satisfied. We've been together for a long time. She works, I work. Everything's fine." Robert listened attentively, but his gaze was so penetrating that Carl felt uncomfortable. Why was he asking such questions? What did he mean by them? Suddenly, Annabelle and Emily returned. They both looked stunning. Black tights, mini skirts, red lips. They looked like they had prepared for something more than just a friendly gathering. Carl couldn't help but notice how Robert immediately started looking at them, his gaze full of admiration. "You look amazing," he said, clearly impressed by their appearance. "I like it." Those words were too obvious, and Carl felt even more uneasy. What was this man doing? How could he so openly admire women, especially his wife, Annabelle? Annabelle and Emily seemed perfectly content with the attention, and suddenly Emily suggested a game. "Let's play a game of dares," she said with a smile, as if it were completely normal. "We can make each other do anything we want." Everyone agreed, except Carl. He still felt that something was wrong. He didn't like how things were unfolding, but he couldn't leave the situation, so he eventually said, "Fine, let's play." His voice sounded slightly defeated, but he decided not to show his nervousness. The game began, and the atmosphere quickly changed. Everyone started asking each other questions and fulfilling small, romantic dares. Carl felt increasingly uncomfortable. Questions kept spinning in his head, questions he couldn't answer. Why had Emily and Annabelle so quickly changed their behavior? What was going on between them and Robert? Why did he feel as though he was losing control over the events around him? During the game, Robert repeatedly glanced at Annabelle and her friend, and each time it seemed as though he was hiding something. Carl tried to stay calm, but he could no longer suppress his emotions. Why was Annabelle behaving this way? Why were Emily and Robert so comfortable with this level of openness? Carl remained in the game, though everything inside him protested against it. It was hard for him to understand what was happening, and this only intensified his suspicions. But really, what if he just accepted it all? Could everything go back to normal if the truth turned out to be too painful? Carl felt the tension in the room rising. The evening was unfolding far differently than he had imagined. Instead of simply spending time with friends, he began to feel like an outsider in his own home. Robert, openly flirting, paid attention to Annabelle and Emily, while Carl tried to ignore what was happening around him. However, each attempt to push these thoughts away became increasingly difficult. They decided to play a game of dares, and everything became even more complicated. Robert, as if unaware of Carl's reactions, began playing by all the rules, pushing the situation toward even greater tension. He won the game and, looking entirely satisfied, made a wish. "Carl, kiss Emily on the lips," he said, leaning forward to see Carl's reaction. Carl felt his heart stop. This was too much for him. "I won't do that," he replied firmly. "My wife, Annabelle, won't tolerate this. That's already cheating, you understand?" Annabelle looked at him with cold eyes and, without blinking, said, "I won't be jealous. Kiss her." And at that moment, something in the atmosphere shifted. Emily, standing nearby, sensed the moment and, without hesitation, approached Carl and passionately kissed him. Carl was bewildered. His thoughts were jumbled, but he couldn't do anything. He just stood there, confused. This was everything he had tried to avoid, but now he couldn't take it back. But this was only the beginning. In the next round, Emily won and made a wish that made Carl feel even more tense. "Annabelle, kiss Robert on the lips," she said, addressing him. Carl watched the scene, trying to control his emotions. He felt extremely uncomfortable, but decided to remain silent to avoid escalating the conflict. He was curious to see what Annabelle would do, and whether she would treat this as indifferently as everything else. And then Annabelle, without hesitation, embraced Robert and kissed him very romantically, and he held her by the waist. To Carl, it felt like a defeat. He couldn't change anything. He felt his heart ache from what was happening, but he didn't even have the strength to react. He didn't want to cause a scene. Annabelle had no hesitation when she kissed him, and Robert, in turn, reciprocated, causing Carl a great deal of pain. When the game finally ended, Carl felt relieved that he could rest, though it was only a temporary reprieve. He was exhausted, and just as he prepared to go to bed, Annabelle unexpectedly said, "I don't want to sleep with you tonight. I want to sleep with Emily in the guest room, and Robert can stay here, on the couch." These words stunned Carl. He was upset but understood he couldn't change anything. He had no choice but to agree. Everyone went to bed, leaving Carl alone with his thoughts. He couldn't sleep. The restless night didn't let him find peace, and he woke up during the night. He heard someone quietly screaming. It sounded like Annabelle, but when he listened closely, the sound stopped. Maybe it was just a dream? He couldn't be sure. The next morning, when Carl woke up, it was already late. Annabelle stood by his bed, looking as if nothing had happened. "Emily and Robert already left," she said quietly. "You slept through the whole night." Carl looked at her, trying to understand what had happened the previous evening, but she no longer seemed like her old self. Her behavior had changed, and he didn't know what to do about it. Had he been so naive as to miss what was happening right before his eyes? He asked, "Why didn't you tell me they were leaving? I didn't even get to say goodbye to them." Annabelle just shrugged, feigning indifference. "I didn't think it was necessary. I thought you needed the rest," she replied. Carl didn't know how to react. All he could do was remain silent. All these moments, all this behavior, were like a puzzle that didn't fit together. Carl felt that everything had changed that day, and that his life would never be the same again. The next few days became a real challenge for Carl. Annabelle stayed late at work more and more often. Previously, when she came home, she always talked about her business partner, Miles, about work, about new ideas for her blog. But recently, she talked about him less and less. It felt as if she was working alone, without anyone else's help or involvement. One evening, when Annabelle was working at home, Carl sat nearby but couldn't help noticing how often she glanced at her phone. Now it was even more obvious. Something strange had emerged in her behavior. A growing sense of suspicion overwhelmed Carl again. He increasingly felt that something had changed between them. "How's work?" he asked, trying to start a conversation with a casual question. Annabelle set her phone down and looked at him, as if trying to hide her reaction. "Oh, it's fine. I'm just a bit tired," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "I decided to have some fun, looking for more men for Emily. I'm talking to a lot of them on a dating site." Carl froze in place. His heart skipped a few beats. He hadn't expected such a response. After she said this, only one thought crossed his mind. What's happening to my wife? He tried to keep his emotions in check and asked, "But she's with Robert now, right? Or isn't she?" Annabelle appeared nonchalant, but her words sounded completely out of place. "Maybe she's with Robert now, but you always need to have a few more options," she said, turning back to her phone screen. Her voice was very calm, but there was something deeply crude in her words, something Carl couldn't ignore. These were her thoughts. He felt her words had nothing to do with love or loyalty. Carl couldn't let it go. He felt deeply uncomfortable. It was all becoming more absurd. "And when Robert and Emily stayed over at our house, did you hear any strange noises at night? Like someone screaming?" he asked, anxiously awaiting her reply. Annabelle didn't answer right away. She thought for a moment, then looked at him, trying to conceal her nervousness. "No, Emily and I slept in the guest room. We didn't hear anything," she replied, trying to remain calm. But Carl felt there was something off about her answer. He saw how tense she became, and his suspicions started to grow. It was clear she was hiding something. Maybe not just a sound, but more, much more. His heart beat faster because he felt she was trying to lie to him without even attempting to make it convincing. Carl began to worry about what was happening between them. He was becoming more aware that something was going on, but he couldn't understand exactly what. It was hard for him to believe it could all be true, but his suspicions were becoming more and more evident. At the same time, he couldn't ignore his feelings. He noticed changes in Annabelle, in her behavior, in her words. And though he tried to convince himself it was all just paranoid thoughts, he couldn't deny that the situation was becoming increasingly confusing. She was growing more distant, and her answers to his questions became less and less satisfying. Each day brought new feelings of unease and uncertainty. Carl could no longer deny that his wife was no longer the woman he once knew. Everything had changed, and he didn't understand why. What had happened to her? Why was she acting as if she was hiding something? In the weeks following that night with Robert and Emily, Carl felt his world slowly falling apart. Annabelle was becoming increasingly detached, her gaze frequently fixed on her phone, and her connections with other men were becoming more obvious. He could no longer ignore this fact. Her promises to remain devoted to him felt empty, and though she tried to maintain a facade, he increasingly realized something was happening, something significant, but he couldn't figure out what. One evening, as Annabelle worked in another room, Carl sat in the living room going over his notes. His thoughts were consumed by one thing. What was happening between them didn't feel natural. Annabelle had changed. She was losing interest in him more and more. From the day she admitted she was looking for men for Emily, his heart hadn't stopped beating to the rhythm of anxiety. One thought kept running through his mind. Was she really cheating? If so, who was the man? Was it Robert? Or someone else? And if it was true, why was she still living with him, deceiving him? At that moment, Carl decided to do something he had never done before. He decided to take matters into his own hands to uncover the truth. It was a step he didn't want to take, but now he couldn't avoid it. His decision was simple. He had to learn more about Annabelle's connections and whether they had gone beyond mere friendship with Emily and Robert. He entered her room and said, "Annabelle, I've noticed you've been spending more time on your phone. I don't want to be intrusive, but could you share a little more with me about what's on your mind? What's going on?" She set the phone down and looked at him. Her eyes were calm, but there was something about them that didn't feel right. "I'm not hiding anything, Carl," she replied evenly. "But sometimes we're just too busy with work to discuss everything. It's just work matters." Carl heard her voice falter slightly. It was a sign. He couldn't make himself believe her words. The feeling of conspiracy became unbearable. "Are you truly happy with your life right now?" he asked, unable to suppress his doubts. "Yes, everything's fine. I'm just really busy right now. Work, personal projects," she replied, trying to avoid his gaze. She turned back to her phone, and Carl realized he probably wouldn't achieve anything with this conversation. But he knew he had to act. That same evening, when Annabelle left for a client meeting, Carl decided to check her phone. When he first touched her phone, his heart skipped a few beats. It felt unnatural. He feared he might find something that would change everything. But he knew that if he didn't do it now, he would never know the truth. Opening the phone, he found messages. Annabelle and Robert had exchanged messages over the past few weeks. At first, it seemed like they were just talking about work or Emily, but the deeper Carl delved, the faster his heart raced. The messages were becoming increasingly romantic. One message from Robert caught Carl's attention. "You were fantastic last night. I want to feel your closeness again." This was enough for Carl to understand that his suspicions were not unfounded. He felt his heart tighten, but his desire to uncover the truth outweighed the pain. Now he was even more convinced that his wife had cheated on him with Robert. But there was something else that surprised Carl. It turned out that Annabelle might not only have been unfaithful to him with Robert, but was also engaging in intimate conversations with other men. The next day, Carl woke up with a heavy sense of anxiety. He couldn't shake the thought that something was going on, but on the other hand, he didn't have concrete proof. He felt lost and didn't know whether he should directly ask Annabelle or continue observing her behavior. His suspicions wouldn't let him rest, but he didn't want to end up in a situation where there was no turning back. Annabelle approached him, kissed him on the cheek, and said with a smile, "I'm spending the night at Emily's tonight. She's having a small party." Carl tried to remain calm. She looked as though nothing had happened, which only fueled his suspicions. "Who else will be at the party?" he asked, trying to appear indifferent. "I'm not sure, but it seems she has a new lover, someone just as wealthy as Robert. She wants to introduce me to him," Annabelle replied, not hiding her excitement over the news. This was the last thing Carl could endure without doubts. Something was wrong, and this new information added fuel to the fire. "Can I come with you?" he suggested, trying to find a way to gather more information. Annabelle laughed. "You probably shouldn't. You'd have to sleep on the floor. Emily doesn't have enough couches," she said, her laughter another signal to Carl that she had begun to change. He felt his nerves tense. What kind of small party was this? Why was she so casually talking about a new lover? Annabelle went to the bathroom, put on her best outfit, applied lipstick, and looked flawless. She got into her car and drove off. Carl stayed home, filled with conflicting thoughts. He felt he needed to find out more. He couldn't allow himself to remain in the dark. After hours of deliberation, Carl decided to go to Emily's house. At first, he sat at home, struggling to make a decision. But in the end, he couldn't leave things as they were. He knew where Emily lived and decided to go. If he didn't get answers, at least he might see something. Maybe Annabelle was lying to him. Or maybe something more. Arriving at Emily's house, Carl parked his car at a distance to avoid drawing attention. He quietly approached the window and began observing. After a few minutes, he saw Annabelle and Emily step out of her room, both looking stunning. They were laughing and well-dressed. This only heightened Carl's suspicions. With them was another man, tall and confident. Carl couldn't clearly see his face, but the way they all interacted and laughed together immediately filled him with unease. This man was definitely not familiar to Carl, and he began drawing conclusions. Annabelle was likely not just part of a new group, but very close to this man. Carl felt his heart sink with disappointment. He didn't want to believe what he saw, but the images haunted him. He still couldn't understand what exactly was happening between them, but in his mind, this was already too much. He continued watching. Annabelle's behavior was strange. She removed her dress. Then Annabelle, Emily, and this man went into a bedroom together. That evening, Carl decided to return home, disheartened and with more questions than answers. It was too overwhelming for him, and he didn't know what to do next. The next morning, Annabelle returned home looking calm. She smiled, greeted him, and started talking about how wonderful the party had been. Carl couldn't wait for the moment when she would have to tell the truth. He wondered how much longer she would keep hiding. "How was it last night?" Carl asked, trying to stay calm. "It was so much fun," Annabelle said, unaware that Carl already knew everything. "I met a new man. He's very interesting and wealthy. Honestly, I think he's the type of man I've been looking for." Carl felt his heart grow cold. He couldn't stay silent any longer. "I saw you last night," he said, his voice low. "I saw you and that man go into the bedroom together." "Were you spying on me?" she said, but Carl could hear despair in her voice. "No, but I was worried about you. You've been acting strangely for a long time. I don't recognize you anymore." The next day, Annabelle returned home late at night. Carl sat on the couch, trying to make sense of what had happened. When she walked in, he couldn't stay silent anymore. "Where were you?" Carl asked without even looking up. His voice was cold and slightly strained. Annabelle didn't seem surprised by the question, though she paused for a moment before answering. She removed her coat and slowly turned to him. "Emily showed me what real life is like and how amazing it is to be free. So, you have no right to follow me anymore." Her voice sounded like a challenge, as if she was enjoying herself rather than trying to explain anything. Carl couldn't believe his ears. She said it as if it were the most normal thing in the world. It was a blow straight to his soul. "This is my game, and I'm the only one who decides what I do," she added. And it seemed like she truly took pleasure in saying it. Carl stood silently, trying to comprehend what exactly she meant. What did she mean by freedom? And why had he suddenly become part of her game? It was so unexpected and painful. After that, Emily arrived, and this time, her company was even more intriguing. She came with a man Carl had never seen before. They walked through the front door, and Carl, still reeling from Annabelle's words, realized that tonight he would have to learn more. His goal was to observe, ask questions, and try to make sense of the situation. "Hi, glad to see you," Carl said, trying to be polite and hide his anxiety. His eyes scanned everyone, Emily, who seemed her usual cheerful self, and the man she had brought with her. He was tall, confident, wearing stylish dark sunglasses, and looked like exactly the type of man who would get involved with someone like Annabelle. "This is James," Emily said, nodding toward the man, who smiled in return. "We met a few weeks ago, and he decided to come with me tonight. Annabelle invited us. Sorry it's so late." Carl barely contained his emotions as he listened to Annabelle continue chatting with James as if nothing was wrong. An idea began forming in his mind about how to proceed. He needed to learn more and be as cautious as possible. If this was really what he thought, he would need a plan. "You can stay the night if you'd like," Carl offered when he heard James mention he didn't have a place to stay. It was spontaneous, but Carl felt it was his chance to learn more. If they stayed, he could at least observe Annabelle's behavior and see if she revealed anything further. Emily and James agreed without hesitation. They didn't question Carl's sudden hospitality, as it was convenient for them. Later, they all sat at the table, and the atmosphere in the room gradually became more relaxed. At first, it seemed like an ordinary gathering of friends, but for Carl, it was a moment to stay sharp. He watched every gesture, listened to every word. He had one goal: to uncover the truth. Later that evening, when everyone gathered on the couch, Emily began talking about her new life and about James. Carl noticed that there was more between them than just friendship. They both laughed, and James gave Emily his undivided attention. At that moment, Carl realized that not only Annabelle might be part of this game. That night, after the guests went to sleep, Carl stayed in the living room. He heard the house grow quiet as everyone retired to their rooms. But inside, his emotions were in turmoil. He couldn't take it anymore. The looks exchanged between Annabelle and James haunted him, and his mind raced with thoughts. This wasn't just a friendly dinner, as he had initially tried to convince himself. This was an intrigue he hadn't yet uncovered. He had assumed her friendship with Emily was just a normal thing, but tonight it felt different. Carl got out of bed, dressed quietly, and went downstairs. He moved down the stairs slowly, trying not to make a sound. Everything was silent. Faint laughter could be heard from below. Carl paused on the stairs to assess the situation. What did he see? It was what he had feared. Annabelle, sitting on the couch, was in James's arms, and Emily was sitting nearby, also kissing James. Their kisses left no room for doubt. Carl stood behind the door, unsure of what to do. His heart was pounding, and his mind struggled to process what was happening. It was so unexpected that at first, he couldn't even take a step forward. But then something pushed him to move. He quietly opened the door and entered the room. When they noticed him, their expressions immediately changed. Emily looked surprised at first, but then a rather unapologetic smile appeared on her face. "Carl," she said, breaking her gaze from James. "You're still up? Maybe you'd like to stay and join us?" Carl stood there, staring at her. His voice was calm, but tinged with coldness. "I'm going to bed, but after what I just saw, I'm not sure I want to." "What do you mean? Didn't you want to notice my betrayal?" Annabelle said, showing slight disdain. Carl looked at James and said, "It seems you've just shown me how you like to have fun." "Don't forget, this is my game, Carl," Annabelle replied, her voice growing more resolute. "You have no right to decide what I do. I haven't felt alive with you in a long time." "Are you saying you've never been honest with me?" he asked. Annabelle smiled. "Carl, I've always been honest with you. You just didn't pay attention. You were so focused on being the perfect husband that you forgot what I really want." "You've been cheating on me right behind my back," Carl said. "It wasn't just once, Carl," Annabelle replied, trying to remain calm. "I've been with other men, even in our house, and sometimes with Emily too. You just didn't notice." Emily shrugged and looked at him without a hint of remorse. "Annabelle has the right to her life, Carl. She beat you. You just didn't see it. You were always trying to control everything, and now it's come to this." Carl felt like he had lost this game, while Annabelle believed she had won, leaving Carl as the defeated one who would endure anything just to stay with her. Carl quietly walked to his room, understanding that he needed more time to figure out what to do next. He was no longer the Carl who had been standing there just hours ago. Everything had changed. Now, he had a plan to get revenge, but his decision was still forming. The next morning, Carl acted as though nothing had happened. He was even overly cheerful, which surprised Annabelle and her guests. She was confident she had one. Her indifference to the situation made her feel more assured. But Carl was already preparing his response, meticulous, clever, and far-reaching. "I have special plans for you," he thought, smiling behind his morning coffee. "Annabelle, I was thinking we haven't celebrated our anniversary properly in a while. What do you say about a little party this week?" Carl asked during breakfast. She gave him a surprised look, but quickly agreed. She was convinced Carl had accepted things as they were and decided not to resist his proposal. "That sounds wonderful, Carl. We can invite our friends and family, and maybe I'll invite Miles too," she asked with slight disdain. "Of course, anyone you want," he replied with flawless politeness. Over the next few days, Carl worked on the party. He invited all their mutual friends, relatives, and even people who had once been a part of their lives but had faded into the background. He prepared carefully, ensuring everything looked perfect. The evening of the party arrived. The house glowed with candlelight and string lights, and all the guests looked stunning. Carl was the perfect host, pouring wine, cracking jokes, and greeting every guest, including James, Emily, and a few others Annabelle knew all too well. She began to feel slightly nervous, but her ego told her Carl was incapable of anything serious. During the evening, Carl asked for everyone's attention. He stood in the center of the room, raising a glass of champagne. "Friends, I want to thank you all for being here. Especially, I want to thank my wife, Annabelle, for her support and love. But tonight, I have something special to do." His voice rang with confidence. Annabelle tensed slightly. "Annabelle," Carl continued, looking directly at her, "I've thought long and hard about what I can do to make you happy. And then I realized that the best gift I could give you is the truth." The room fell silent. Carl pulled out a remote and turned on the television. The screen lit up with messages, romantic conversations, photos, and videos he had found while going through her chats and secret files on her laptop. Her face turned pale. "As you can see, friends, my wife decided that marriage doesn't necessarily mean honesty. But that's not all. Emily, you've also been an amazing friend," he added with a sarcastic smile. The recordings continued, showing how Emily had helped Annabelle organize her affairs. The guests began whispering among themselves, while James and Emily looked visibly uncomfortable. Annabelle, who had been trying to maintain her composure, stood up from her chair. "This is disgusting, Carl. How could you spy on me?" Carl calmly replied, "And how could you deceive me? Not just me, but our friends too. You thought you'd won, Annabelle, but Karma and I had other plans. And to think I suspected you of cheating with Miles, but he turned out to be a decent man." With that, he pulled out divorce papers and placed them on the table. "Everything is already signed. The house, the accounts, even your car. They were all in my name. You're left with nothing." "You have no right," she shouted, grabbing the documents. "Actually, I do. But that's not all. Annabelle, remember how I said I'd give you the best gift? You're free. You can live however you want, but not on my dime anymore." He turned to the guests. "And now, friends, let's get back to celebrating. After all, today is a day of freedom for everyone." Annabelle ran out of the room, while Carl stayed behind, calm and satisfied, knowing his revenge was flawless. He hadn't given in to emotions but used logic and cold calculation. Karma truly played its part. What do you think? Was Carl's revenge on Annabelle too harsh?